It may not come as too much of a surprise that the gangs have significantly increased their control over the methamphetamine market, but also the rise of social media platforms and encrypted messaging apps have transformed drug sales, making it easier to access drugs. More than 10,000 people participated in the annual New Zealand Drug Trends Survey, which asks about drug use patterns, pricing, access to services, and perceptions of drug policy. The survey also looked at what regions are being hit the hardest with meth use, and how social media platforms are facilitating quick, discrete transactions that can often lead to scams and exposure to unsafe substances. New Zealand Drugs Research Team lead researcher Professor Chris Wilkins said the data showed gangs were involved in every level of meth supply, from importation to selling it. And he joins me now. Chris, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Look, lovely to talk to you. I appreciate your time. Let's start with one of the big findings. A third of meth buyers are getting their supply directly from gang members or gang associates. Did that level of gang control surprise you?
It did a little bit. I think everyone accepts that gangs are involved in importation and local wholesaling, but I guess we weren't expecting them to be so involved in the straight-up retail end. And one of the things, there's a lot of general talk about drugs and gangs, but we looked at that by different drug types, and methamphetamine was overwhelmingly the drug that people were buying from gangs. About 10%, so 33% from gangs. For cannabis, it was only about 10%, but for all the other drugs, it was below around 5%. So gangs were clearly involved in the methamphetamine market.
Yeah, that's interesting, eh? I wanted to just touch on that, Chris. Yeah, you said when it came to cannabis, the one I've read said it was about 13% was gang-linked.
Yeah.
And as cocaine sits at 6%, MDMA 5%, and LSD 3%. So meth is clearly the main focus for gangs, and it seems like they've stepped away from the weed game. Why meth over the others? It pure profit?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think some of this has to do that gangs have historically had a really strong relationship with methamphetamine. So outlaw motorcycle gangs had recipes for methamphetamine for a long time. But essentially in more recent times, I think it's just profit straight up that methamphetamine is the most profitable drug. There's opportunities to import it in very large quantities now and make a lot of money. And so that whole process lends itself to gangs that happen to be internationally connected certain global regions.
And we're seeing higher meth use in the regions like Northland, Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, and also down south. Why are these areas hotspots, Chris?
Yeah, I think that was one of another interesting findings from the survey was, I think a lot of your listeners are expecting to hear that there's high levels of gang selling of meth in, say, Northland and the East Coast and central North Island, but we also found high levels of meth selling in Southland, the West Coast, and Tasman, top of the South Island. So it seems to us that gangs, of course, they're active in very big markets for methamphetamine, but they also play a role in terms of smaller markets and being the seller of last resort. So it's really interesting to think about that, whether gangs are pushing or spreading methamphetamine use around other regions as well.
I found this interesting too, that places like Gizzy and Hawke's Bay, which is my home city, 70% of buyers think or said just one or two gangs run the whole meth scene, and that suggests serious monopolization. So in areas, essentially, there are gang strongholds now.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important point. So as I said, again, there's often a general conversation about gangs being involved in drug selling, but what we wanted to do is just to delve a bit more into that, because it seems to us that they become most harmful for their communities when there's a monopolization process, when one or two gangs dominate the meth market, push out all other non-gang sellers, and that funnels the profit into a handful of organisations. And why that's important is because then, if they're in that monopoly situation, they're generating profit and income, which can be reinvested back into the organisation, and much more insidious things like corruption and violence. So they can invest in firearms and weapons that make them even more dominant in their local region.
Chris, wastewater testing showed that meth use hit a record 39.2 kgs in a week last October, and that was nearly double the previous peak. And what does that tell us about demand and availability right now? Why has demand shot up? And has the price gone down, or just really heavy pushing by the gangs?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, as you know, the wastewater testing results are just really extraordinary. So basically, methamphetamine consumption in New Zealand doubled in the last 6 months, which is hard to get your mind around. And that's not just one data point; it's 2 quarters where it stayed that high. So that should be a real concerning thing. Just because you obviously got the consumption, but the flow on social problems that you get from that, we're yet to see. So we'll see those over the months, and sometimes they can be quite hidden, like dangerous driving, violence in households, family violence, but also just general crime that increases that we don't necessarily connect with methamphetamine. Yes, this seems to be largely supply-side driven. So we have picked up a 38% decline in the price of a gram of meth over the last 3 or 4 years. So the sad reality is, in some parts of the world, methamphetamine can be produced on an industrial scale, which means the unit price just plummets. So, and what has been happening is New Zealand has traditionally got its methamphetamine from Southeast Asia, but what's happened now is increasingly supply is coming from Central America, Mexican cartels, but also North America. And the scale of production is much higher there, and they're basically undercutting the Asian price by quite a bit. Yeah. So Australian enforcement said that last year, 70% of methamphetamine they seized was actually from Mexico, not from Southeast Asia, which has been the traditional source for decades. So there's a little bit of a global price war, and
that's bringing it down in price.
There could potentially be really big implications for that, because Mexican cartels. It may also explain how you might have noted that there was an increase in cocaine use in New Zealand, and that may well be the same Mexican cartels that are entering the meth market, of course, have a lot of cocaine. So they are, and they're very efficient organisations. So, that's a concern.
Yeah, you're right. Cocaine has also risen, hasn't it? Hey, Chris, are the 501 deportees having an impact on the drug scene? Have they reshaped the market at all?